Hey, I'm Sam. Welcome to Brickwall Unplugged. Today I'm going through a single-elimination tournament to crown the best zombie film ever made. Happy Halloween, everybody, because all of October is Halloween, and if you didn't know, October starts on September 1st. We have 48 zombie movies in this bracket. You can see some are getting a free advance to the next round. That's just how it worked out with the numbering, but to keep it totally fair, I'm randomizing the order continuously right now. Every time I click, the order is getting randomized, and I'm just going to stop clicking, not looking. And there we have it. This is our finalized order for the tournament. But before we get started, just a quick little reminder. If you're looking for something spooky to read this Halloween season, might I recommend my horror novel, South of the Mason-Dixon. It's available in paperback, obviously, but you can also get it in ebook. It's in the Kindle Unlimited program. If you have that, you can read it for free. And if you missed my announcement, there is now an audiobook version of this novel, narrated by someone with a much nicer voice than me. You'll find links down in the description to learn more and to grab your own copy. But anyway, back to the tournament. Okay, we are starting off with a doozy. We have Dawn of the Dead versus Evil Dead 2. That's the original Dawn of the Dead versus Evil Dead 2, which are two of my favorite movies of all time. I don't know how the fuck I got stuck with one of the most grueling matchups right off the bat. This could easily be the final two going head-to-head. I mean, I am leaning one way versus the other. I think part of my consideration here is the fact that Evil Dead has the Deadites, which are very zombie-like, but they aren't exactly zombies. They're zombie enough to qualify for the tournament, but I don't think they're zombie enough to win. Dawn of the Dead, the OG, moving forward. Okay, next up is Resident Evil versus Night of the Creeps. This is a super easy one. It is Night of the Creeps immediately. I think, if I remember correctly, I put Resident Evil in here as a placeholder for all of the Resident Evil movies, that full movie series. The games are a completely unrelated thing. I like the games quite a lot, most of them anyway. The movies all fucking suck, even the first one. All of them. They're all terrible. And Paul W. Sanderson, if you've never looked into his scandals, I encourage you to do so, because he is, let's say, prone to negligence on his film sets. Go ahead and Google the stunt woman who lost her arm on one of the Resident Evil movies, and just, peruse that story. See how you feel about the Resident Evil movie series and Paul W. Sanderson after that. But even if the sets were, everyone was happy and having a great time on those sets, they're still just awful movies. Okay, Night of the Living Dead versus Re-Animator. This, again, is the original Night of the Living Dead, George A. Romero's. This is really the film that kickstarted the entire zombie genre. You always need to put the little asterisk that it isn't technically the first zombie movie, but it is the first movie to feature zombies as we know them today, like the colloquial zombie. There was like the voodoo type of zombie that you could see in that old Bela Lugosi movie, White Zombie and whatnot. And they're not even called zombies in Night of the Living Dead, but that's a whole other can of worms. The original is a classic. The originator, you got to give it a whole lot of respect and credit for that. Re-Animator, on the other hand, is a real favorite of mine, a real underrated favorite. If you can see way in the background, that's a painting I did of the Re-Animator poster. I adore that movie. It's really funny, extremely entertaining, great gore effects, fantastic finale. I think it would be a shame to lose the originator in the first round. If I was just going to pick one to watch, I would pick Re-Animator. I've seen both of these several times, like both of these probably over a dozen times each. Both great movies. I think Re-Animator is more entertaining, but it's obviously less important to the genre. I think I'm going to go Night of the Living Dead on this first one. Okay, next up is Fido versus The House by the Cemetery. These are both a little, they're not obscure, but they're a little actually, House by the Cemetery might be a little obscure. This is one of Lucio Fulci's many movies involving zombies. They're a little, they're not exactly the classic zombies, but there are zombies in this movie. There's also lots of other stuff going on. This is one of those Italian horror movies where the plot doesn't make a ton of sense. But it's a lot of fun. It's very gory. It's not great, though. It's one of Fulci's lesser works, I would say. But it's still pretty entertaining. Fido is a zombie comedy that, I don't know, I didn't find it that funny or that entertaining. House by the Cemetery is going to move on here. Okay, Zombie Strippers versus Dead Heat. So exactly how tough the first matchup was of Dawn of the Dead versus the Evil Dead 2, This is the polar opposite now. Zombie Strippers versus Dead Heat. These movies both suck. They're both bad. Dead Heat, I had recommended to me as like an underrated, forgotten, obscure little gem. And it's not at all. It's another like zombie comedy, and it's so unfunny. Such terrible dialogue and terrible acting from what's his name, Joe Piscopo or whatever. That guy's awful. He is so unfunny and such a bad actor. Zombie Strippers is bad too. However, I know some people who worked on this movie, so I'm gonna give them a pass through round one out of respect to them and out of how bad Dead Heat was. Okay, next up is Day of the Dead. Again, the original, not either of the two remakes. Versus Dead Alive, aka this should say Brain Dead, not Brain Damage, but that's what it is. Whatever, I can't edit it this, or can I? No, I can't. But Dead Alive, Brain Dead, same movie. This is one of Peter Jackson's movies, pre-Lord of the Rings, making huge blockbusters and whatnot. And it's my favorite Peter Jackson film. I enjoy it much more than the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy, which I do think is great. Like, they're excellent films. Those are, technically speaking, much better films. Dead Alive is so entertaining, though. Dead Alive, it's another zombie comedy, but it's also, like, it's legitimately, I was going to say legitimately gory, but it goes beyond that. This is one of the goriest movies ever made. This, I think, is a strong contender for straight-up goriest zombie movie. One of the goriest movies of all time, regardless of, subgenre or whatever. The gore is so excessive that it is hilarious. This movie, I had the immense pleasure of seeing this in a packed theater at a midnight screening one time, and I have never heard such raucous laughter in a movie theater before, not in like straight up comedies, whatever. Dead Alive is such a crowd pleaser. It is so much fun. Now, Day of the Dead versus Dead Alive is really tough. It's almost as tough as Dawn of the Dead versus Evil Dead 2. This is really tough because these are such different movies. One is like really serious about the zombie apocalypse. The other one is as goofy and over the top as you could possibly get. I think for the sake of variety, because this is really coming down to a coin flip, this one. I think I'm going to go Dead Alive. Okay, Overlord versus 28 Weeks Later. Overlord was a pretty fun, like, Nazi zombie kind of thing, but 28 Weeks Later is the better movie. 28 Weeks Later is often living in the shadow of 28 Days Later, but I think it's really, really good in its own right. We'll see if Weeks Later and Days Later end up meeting later on in the tournament. Okay, next up is The Dead versus Bride of Re-Animator. What is The Dead? I may have forgotten a word in this title. I prepped this tournament, like I filled out this bracket months ago, and I don't remember what I put in here. Oh, yes, I have seen this. This is the movie I was thinking of. It's not good. The Dead, not good. I forgot about it between the time I made the bracket and by the time I'm ranking it. The Dead is no good. Bride of Re-Animator is moving forward. REC, a.k.a. R-E-C, a.k.a. the abbreviation for recording, which was remade in the States as Quarantine. The original was made in Spain, I believe. It's a found footage, almost a mockumentary, actually, because it's a news crew. The line between found footage and mockumentary gets a little blurry, I guess. I would say it's found footage. All set in one building. If you've seen Quarantine, you've basically seen a much worse version of the exact same movie. REC is really good. REC 2 is also in the tournament, so I won't say anything about it yet. But REC is good. The Beyond is Lucio Fulci again. Much better than House by the Cemetery. It's still not my favorite of Fulci's zombie movies. We'll get to that one later. But it's really good. It's also, again, only like partially a zombie movie. There's lots of other stuff going on. There's like gratuitous like tarantula attacks and shit like that. And there's like ghosts hitting people with like chains and all kinds of craziness. It really only becomes like a full-blooded zombie movie in the last act. And it's a lot of fun when it does. I think I'm going to go REC, however. This is an interesting matchup because they're so different. I think I'm going to go REC. Okay, next up, Survival of the Dead versus White Zombie. As I said earlier, Survival of the Dead, not good. It's Romero's worst of his Dead series, I think. I think a lot of people might say that Diary of the Dead was worse. But what I say is Diary of the Dead at least has that badass Amish guy in that one scene. That alone makes it better than the drudgery of Survival of the Dead. White Zombie's not really a zombie movie. I mentioned it earlier. It's like the old school like voodoo mind control kind of zombie, not like what we think of as like flesh-eating zombies, you know. I mean, it's better than Survival of the Dead. I don't think it'll go any further, though, because it's not, like, really the type of zombie we're talking about, though. Okay, next up we have Demons versus the Wailing. Demons I reviewed, I think, 2 years ago in the Macabre Month of Horror. That video is over on the Brickwall Pictures channel, not on the Brickwall Unplugged channel. Because if you didn't know, this is my second channel where I do unscripted, off-the-cuff content like this versus the other channel is more, like, scripted, more heavily edited and whatnot. The Wailing, I think, is a great South Korean horror film. It's a little less zombie-centric. There's so much going on in The Wailing. The Wailing, like, changes subgenres, like, 5 times throughout the movie, and I love that about it. Because it's only a zombie movie to a smaller degree, I'm going to go with Demons. But if we're just picking which is the better movie, it's definitely The Wailing. The Wailing gets a big recommendation, a much bigger, stronger recommendation than Demons, which is still, you know, it's a fun time. Very gory. Okay, Scooby-Doo. I forgot I put this on here. Scooby-Doo Zombie Island versus Peninsula. Peninsula is the sequel to Train to Busan, if you didn't know. Sometimes the title is written out as like Train to Busan Presents Peninsula or whatever, as if Train to Busan is like a releasing company or something. That's just when like really shameless producers or distributors or whoever need to milk the name recognition of Train to Busan, which is just stupid. And they couldn't call it Train to Busan too because there's no Train to Busan in the sequel. It's basically just another zombie movie in the same zombie apocalypse, which is just a completely generic zombie apocalypse. There's like no tethering, none of the same characters or anything. Completely unrelated, basically. It's like just a different zombie movie. And it's a much worse zombie movie than Train to Busan. Peninsula kind of sucks. It's more of a outright action movie, which could be fine, but the action is not particularly good. What's really bad is all of the CGI, which the first one had a little bit of, but it kept it colored within the lines, let's say. Peninsula, on the other hand, has like these huge protracted car chases where the entire thing is CG. It's not like they're using CG to zhuzh up a car chase. It's like little PS2 cars moving around with like crappy physics and stuff. It's awful. Scooby-Doo Zombie Island is somehow moving on to the next round by virtue of not being as bad as Peninsula. Okay, House of the Dead versus Rabid. Rabid is David Cronenberg. House of the Dead is Uwe Boll. I don't think I need to say anything more than that. Rabid is moving on. Okay, The Crazies versus The Serpent and the Rainbow. I've seen both versions of The Crazies. I've seen that remake that I think had like Timothy Olyphant in it, and I've seen the original, the George A. Romero one. I definitely prefer the George A. Romero one by a lot. I don't think the remake was like terrible. It was, I would say, different in a good way, where like it really distinguished itself from the original. It didn't feel just like, doing the same thing again but worse, or like changing the wrong things. It felt like a completely different movie, so I respect it for that. It's not great, though. But I'm going to count the original, The Crazies, here, versus The Serpent and the Rainbow. Now, The Serpent and the Rainbow is an interesting one because it came out in the 80s, post, zombies as we know it, post Romero kickstarting that genre. But it is going back to the older style of zombie. This is like straight-up Haitian voodoo type zombie. So very different take on the subgenre. It's kind of not even in the subgenre. It's kind of just like its own different type of horror movie. I really like The Serpent and the Rainbow a lot. I'm due for a rewatch on this one too, because it's been many years since I've seen this one. But I really loved it. I think it's probably Craven's most underrated movie, I would say. But I'm definitely going to go The Crazies on this, the George A. Romero Crazies. I really dig this movie. It has a lot of the great like early stages, post-apocalyptic stuff that I love, like the people adapting to the new world and figuring things out, which was the focus of my first book, The Fall of Polite, that sort of period early on in the apocalypse where people are adapting to the new rules of society and whatnot. You can check out my book, The Fall of Polite, if you want to see my take on the post-apocalypse. I will say, I didn't see The Crazies for the first time until after I wrote my book, so it's not like there's, it wasn't an influence on it, but it tackles a lot of the same post-apocalyptic stuff that I love to see in the genre. Okay, City of the Living Dead versus 28 Days Later. City of the Living Dead is fine. It's a weird one. City of the Living Dead is Fulci again. It's another one of Fulci's many Living Dead movies. Again, they're not like, it's not as much of a zombie movie as you might expect. He's really trying to cash in on the whole Living Dead thing after he already cashed in on the whole zombie thing with the Dawn of the Dead situation. It's an okay movie. It's very bizarre, as all of Fulci's movies are, really. I think this is the one where the zombies don't eat people, but they instead grab people's heads and they like crush the brains out of the backs of their heads. 28 Days Later, however, is definitely moving on. This is one of the modern classics. It popularized the whole fast zombie thing. And don't bother splitting hairs in the whole, oh, they're infected with rage, they're not zombies. Like, they're fucking zombies. Get real, as David Lynch would say. It's a fantastic zombie movie. It's one that tends to get better with each rewatch. The post-apocalyptic world building is phenomenal as well. Great performances too, which you don't get in a lot of these zombie movies. Like really strong character work, which I think shines through in Alex Garland's screenplay. Fantastic screenwriter and now director too, now that he's directing stuff. Okay, Diary of the Dead versus Planet Terror. As I said earlier, Diary of the Dead is not good. I like the Amish guy in his one scene. He's fun, he's cool and over the top and ridiculous and goofy. Otherwise, that movie has like nothing worthwhile. Planet Terror's moving on easily. Okay, now we move over to the right side of the bracket. I think. Maybe not. Oh, I forgot to make it a two-sided bracket. Okay, there's no right side of the bracket this time. We're going ParaNorman next versus Dawn of the Dead. So we saw Dawn of the Dead already. ParaNorman is, this is its first round because it's one of the ones that got to kind of leapfrog into the second round right away. ParaNorman is a kids movie. It's like a stop-motion animated movie, or at least it's made to look stop motion. I guess it could be 3D animated. I don't know. I didn't look into ParaNorman too much. I saw this movie when it came out, actually, just because I think I had a friend who wanted to see it. I probably wouldn't have ever watched it otherwise. I don't care about ParaNorman. It was fine, very forgettable. Didn't have a whole lot going for it. Dawn of the Dead is easily moving on. Okay, Night of the Creeps versus Train to Busan, which I touched on when I talked about the sequel, Peninsula. Train to Busan, much, much, much better than Peninsula. I think Train to Busan's got to move on here. One of the best zombie movies of recent years. Fantastic South Korean action drama take on the zombie subgenre. It's less of a horror movie, though there's still some horror in there, but it's much more of the action and surprisingly like touching emotional drama side of things too. Really good, really solid zombie movie. Night of the Creeps I like a whole lot. Very funny, very quotable with the whole thrill me thing. Super entertaining, really good time. But Train to Busan's moving on. Okay, Dead and Buried, gotta pass through the first round, and it probably wouldn't have moved on otherwise. Night of the Living Dead is beating Dead and Buried. Dead and Buried is on like the Video Nasty list, and it's got a reputation as like this notorious, like fucked up movie. It's like so tame. Like, what was it even doing on the Video Nasty list? It's like the least extreme and controversial movie on there. It seems like just a mistake that it was even on the Video Nasty list. It's just a really generic, boring, bland horror movie. I don't really think there's any reason to go back and watch that one. Okay, The House by the Cemetery versus World War Z. I don't really care for World War Z. I don't think it's like awful, but it's very much like a mainstream blockbuster, which is just not my kind of thing. It could have been worse, I suppose, but there's not a whole lot about it that works. House by the Cemetery is moving on, and it's lucky to move on because it's not that good of a movie to have made it through 2 rounds. Okay, La Horde versus Zombie Strippers. Speaking of being lucky to move on, Zombie Strippers was lucky as shit to move past that first round. La Horde's moving on here. La Horde, if you haven't seen it, this is, I guess, probably one of the lesser known movies on the list. It is a French action zombie movie set either all or at least mostly in a big, like, high-rise apartment building. It's kind of like The Raid with zombies. I think it predates The Raid. But it's really over-the-top action. It's like these gangster, low-level criminal guys fighting La Horde of zombies with, like, machetes and a minigun. It's really crazy and over the top. It's a fun movie. Okay, Dead Alive versus The Dawn of the Dead remake. The Dawn of the Dead remake is surprisingly good. It's really good. It's not anywhere near as good as the original, but few movies are. Dead Alive is going to move on still, but I will say I like the Dawn of the Dead remake quite a lot. I've watched it multiple times. And it's good. It's enjoyable. It's a solid, like, modern, mid-2000s era zombie movie. One of the best of, I would say, that decade when zombie movies were really being cranked out rapid fire. It stood out from the pack a little bit. It was also Zack Snyder's first directed movie, and I think it was his best movie by far. James Gunn wrote the screenplay. So even though I like the Dawn of the Dead remake, and I think it's Zack Snyder's best movie, I still have absolutely no interest in seeing his new zombie movie, that Army of the Dead. Not fucking interested. Keep it to yourself, all right? Okay, Pet Sematary versus 28 Weeks Later. This is the original Pet Sematary. I have not watched the remake. Not really interested in it, because I don't even think the original is very good. I might check out Stephen King's book at some point. But I don't think the original movie is all that good. It's not like awful, but it's one of the weaker Stephen King adaptations. Like terrible acting, really cheesy. Just it didn't really get a whole lot out of it. I'm also pretty sure that his book and this movie got an entire generation to think that cemetery is spelled this way, because that's how Stephen King spelled it. It's not how it's spelled. I think it's spelled that way because like the kid who writes the grave writes Cemetery, that's how he thinks it's spelled. Bride of Re-Animator versus Zombieland. Zombieland's another one that snuck through the first round. It's a really good one, actually. I like Zombieland. I'm just now realizing I never watched Zombieland 2. I kind of forgot that it came out. It came and went so quickly. I am curious to check it out. I didn't hear anything about it. I never heard anybody talk about it. I don't know if it was good or bad. I'll have to watch that this October. I genuinely forgot it existed until I saw Zombieland right here. Anyway, Bride of Re-Animator, I didn't really talk about much because it was up against a real non-contender. So just like Re-Animator, I love Bride of Re-Animator. It's so much fun. It's almost on par with the original. I definitely have a soft spot for the original. But Bride of Re-Animator is rock solid. It's really good. I have yet to see the third one beyond Re-Animator, because it can be pretty hard to find. But I think I'm going to try to watch that this Halloween. Bride of Re-Animator versus Zombieland is a weird matchup. They're pretty similar. They're both very comedic. I think I might lean Bride of Re-Animator, but this is actually a pretty close one. Okay, Shaun of the Dead versus Wreck. Shaun of the Dead snuck through that first round, but I'm pretty sure it would have gone on anyway. Shaun of the Dead's going to win here. Shaun of the Dead is a fantastic zombie movie and a fantastic comedy. There's like no trade-off necessary, which is really impressive, and lots of genre mashups don't nail perfectly. Lots of horror comedies, they land one way or the other, and I still would say Shaun of the Dead's definitely more comedy than horror, but it strikes a really nice balance. Okay, White Zombie versus Return of the Living Dead. Like I said, White Zombie kind of got through the first round on a technicality. Return of the Living Dead, however, is fucking fantastic. This is another one that is really funny, on top of being an excellent zombie movie. Such great special effects, fantastic writing. You have Dan O'Bannon at the helm, who was responsible in part for creating Alien, the original Alien. Return of the Living Dead is also connected to Night of the Living Dead. For all the movies with the Living Dead in the title, this one is technically an official sequel to Night of the Living Dead, even though it came many years later, many years after Dawn of the Dead, and didn't have George A. Romero involved. Basically, I think his name is John A. Russo. That guy co-created Night of the Living Dead with George A. Romero. When they split, that guy got the rights to Living Dead as the title. So Romero just took Dead. That's why it's not Dawn of the Living Dead, it's just Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead, not Living Dead. So Return of the Living Dead is like the other half of this weird bifurcated series, the far less popular half of that series. But really good. Return of the Living Dead is excellent. Okay, Rec 2 versus Demons. It's got to be Rec 2 here. Rec 2 is a lot of fun. It's a great way to make a sequel to Rec. It's taking a similar... Well, it's taking the same setting, but bringing in a completely different cast of characters into it. This time it's like armed soldiers cleaning up the mess from the first movie, which I think is really clever, and Rec 2 did it well, but I have also seen a bunch of really shitty horror sequels attempt the same thing and fall flat on their face. Okay, Scooby-Doo Zombie Island. Forgot I was on here again already. Versus. Scooby-Doo Zombie Island versus. Just like Demons, Versus is a movie that I reviewed in a past year's Macabre Month of Horror over on the Brickwall Pictures channel. So head on over there to hear my full thoughts on Versus. Versus is moving on. It is a fun Yakuza versus zombies action horror mashup. Okay, Evil Dead versus Rabid. This is the first and original Evil Dead, not the Evil Dead remake or Evil Dead Rise. Those ones aren't even on the list. Just the original Evil Dead. And it is fantastic. It's a classic. Evil Dead 2 is my favorite by, I would say, a significant margin. But then the original Evil Dead is definitely my second favorite of that series. It's above Army of Darkness and it's above either of the modern ones, substantially. Rabid is pretty good. I think I reviewed Rabid. Pretty sure I reviewed Rabid over on the Brickwall Pictures channel. I'm not 100% certain, but I think there's a review for it over there. I'm like 80% sure there's a review for Rabid on my main channel. Okay, The Crazies versus Zombie 2. Zombie 2 is my top Fulci zombie movie. I think it's his best zombie movie by a pretty substantial margin. Now, Zombie, I don't want to spend too long on it because it takes forever to explain, but Zombie 2 is also known as just Zombie, and it's also known as Zombie Flesh Eaters, and Zombie Flesh Eaters 2. I'm going to try to get through this quickly because I could easily spend like 10 minutes unfurling how this fucked up title and series operates. The basics of it are that Lucio Fulci decided to make a fake sequel to George A. Romero's Dawn of the Dead after it was super successful. But Dawn of the Dead in other parts of the world is just known as just Zombie, just the word zombie. So Fulci made Zombie 2 as a pretend sequel to Dawn of the Dead, even though it has nothing to do with Dawn of the Dead, and it was completely unlicensed and unauthorized. The closest thing to a connection is actually Dario Argento serving as a producer on Dawn of the Dead and working frequently with the band Goblin, who did a bunch of music for Dawn of the Dead. That's like how it gets connected to the Italian horror film industry at all, is through Dario Argento being a producer on Dawn of the Dead. Well, there's a whole like Italian version of Dawn of the Dead, which is quite different from the US version. It's not like a whole different movie, but there are differences beyond just the music being different. There are other changes too. Fake sequels was a huge trend in Italy around this era. I might do a video on that at some point because it's kind of interesting. Anyway, Zombie 2 is moving on. It's going up against an actual George A. Romero movie, The Crazies, but Zombie 2 is moving on. Also, The Crazies, they're less like zombies than Romero's mainline Dead series. There's zombie-like, zombie-esque stuff going on, but it's a little different. Okay, One Cut of the Dead versus 28 Days Later. This is a tougher one than you might expect. One Cut of the Dead is quite recent. It's only a few years old. It is phenomenal. I, like everybody else who recommends this movie, am going to say, look up nothing about this movie. Just watch the movie. I will add the caveat, stick with it if you think it's bad at first, because I thought it was kind of bad at first. I was like, why are people recommending this so much? And it's not very good, but just wait. It will all make sense. It's intentional. There's a greater purpose to it all. That's all I'm going to say. And just go watch One Cut of the Dead. It is really excellent. It's genius, I would even say. That being said, it still comes up short compared to 28 Days Later, as far as zombie movies go. 28 Days Later is moving on. Okay, next up, Planet Terror versus Land of the Dead. Like I said, I'm due for a rewatch of Land of the Dead. I remember it being like okay, kind of middling, far below the first three of the Dead series. Planet Terror is going to move on here. Planet Terror, if you aren't aware, you probably are, but it's the first half of Grindhouse. It's Robert Rodriguez's half of Grindhouse. These are very pussy, bulbous zombies. Okay, Dawn of the Dead versus Train to Busan. Two really great movies. One old school 70s masterpiece. One modern classic in the making. Dawn of the Dead's moving on, though. For as good as Train to Busan is, this isn't even close, really. Night of the Living Dead versus The House by the Cemetery. It's got to be Night of the Living Dead. House by the Cemetery was lucky to get this far. It really doesn't deserve to be 3 rounds deep. It just happened to get paired up with very easy prey. Okay, La Horde versus Dead Alive. This is interesting because they're both so over the top and ridiculous. It's Dead Alive easily, though. La Horde's fun, and it's one you might not have seen, so I can give it a recommendation. It's not amazing or anything, though. Okay, 28 Weeks Later versus Bride of Re-Animator. I do like 28 Weeks Later a whole lot. I think it's really good. It's not as good as 28 Days Later. It's not as, nuanced, and the characters aren't as deep, and the performances aren't Well, the performances are still pretty good, actually. I think I'm going to go Bride of Re-Animator, though, which is weird because Re-Animator was eliminated right away, and Re-Animator is definitely better than Bride of Re-Animator, but that's just how the pairings shook out. That's part of this whole format. Okay, Shaun of the Dead versus Return of the Living Dead. These are both of the comedic variety, so it's an interesting pairing. I'm leaning towards Shaun of the Dead right off the bat, but it's pretty tough. They're both really, really good. I want to say, I always see people call Shaun of the Dead a parody of the zombie genre, and I don't think it is at all. I think it's just a zombie movie that is also a comedy. I don't think it's really a parody. It's more like a comedy that's an homage and an embodiment of a genre. And I think that holds true for the other movies in the Cornetto trilogy as well. I think I'm going to go Shaun of the Dead, but it's really close between these two, actually. I could kind of go either way. This is one of those ones where, depending on the day of the week, I might go one or the other. Rec 2 versus. Now, the thing with versus, which you'll hear more about if you go watch the review on my main channel, is that it's so much fun, but it is very technically weak. It looks awful. It's shot on that early DV cam stuff that just looks terrible. There's some bad acting in it, but also some really fun over-the-top acting. The action is so much fun, but it's also just ridiculous. And it's really goofy and over the top. It's the kind of movie that feels like friends fucking around in the woods, even though it's not really what it was. But it's that kind of ultra low budget type thing. Some of the effects look really bad. But it's just so much fun, and it's so original and inventive, and it has such a strong indie passion for filmmaking without resources spirit to it that I'm gonna move it on. I'm gonna let it get through another round here. Okay, Evil Dead versus Zombie 2. I think that same consideration of the Deadites aren't exactly zombies. I'm gonna let that be the deciding factor here and have Zombie 2 move forward here. Okay, and the last matchup of this round is 28 Days Later versus Planet Terror. It's going to be 28 Days Later, moving forward. Okay, Dawn of the Dead versus Night of the Living Dead. As I alluded to earlier, this is actually a really easy decision. It's Dawn of the Dead. I feel like Romero took everything that he established and just perfected it with Dawn of the Dead. Dead Alive versus Bride of Re-Animator. This is actually a pretty easy one, too. It's going to be Dead Alive. Dead Alive is, I love it. Shaun of the Dead versus. This is where versus' run comes to an end, and Shaun of the Dead's got to move forward. Zombie 2 versus 28 Days Later. This is actually kind of tough. Zombie 2, for as goofy and cheesy as it is, has so much about it that is memorable and fun. The soundtrack is great. The zombie versus shark fight is unforgettable. It's got an eye impalement, which was a real staple of Fulci's entire filmography. Great gore, a great finale with the Molotovs and the shotguns and the building that's being sieged and all that. Really, really great stuff. But I think 28 Days Later is the one that's got to move on. Okay, we are near the end here. 2 more matchups, and then the grand final. Dawn of the Dead versus Dead Alive is pretty tough, but I have a clear leaning immediately, and that's Dawn of the Dead. Dead Alive is really good, though. I'm glad I made it this far. And then Shaun of the Dead versus 28 Days Later. I think I'm going to go the serious route versus the comedic route here and go 28 Days Later. And then the final matchup is Dawn of the Dead versus 28 Days Later. Old school versus new school. Kind of the watershed moment, really. But it's going to be Dawn of the Dead. I kind of knew this from the beginning, I feel like. Usually when I do these tournaments, I have no clue what's going to win. With this one, I had a real strong... I didn't think of each of these matchups individually all the way through, but I definitely had a gut impulse that Dawn of the Dead was going to win. I've called it the best zombie movie in the past, and I still believe that to be true. Dawn of the Dead is the greatest zombie movie of all time. This tournament proves it beyond a shadow of a doubt. It's now illegal to have any other opinion. No, I'm just kidding. You can disagree on all of these, and feel free to let me know in the comments what would have won your tournament, and if you disagreed on any particular matchups. Also, are there any zombie movies that I didn't include that you would have included, like perhaps The Living Dead of the Manchester Morgue, or Cemetery Man, or one of those other ones? Let me know if there's any other zombie movies you would have liked to have seen included. I could feasibly do a second iteration of this in the future. There are enough zombie movies out there. I don't know if I'll ever get around to that, but It's a possibility. Anyway, thanks for watching. You can subscribe to Brickwall Unplugged if you enjoyed this and you want to see more tournaments and list reactions and tier lists and stuff like it. Throughout October, I'm going to have a few more of these. I'm going to be doing the best slasher films, the best horror video games. So be sure to subscribe and stick around for those. And again, if you want to check out my horror novel, South of Mason-Dixon, it's available. Look down in the description. You'll find a link for it.